Okay, it's been a it's been a bit of a whirlwind of a semester. I don't know how fast things have felt like they're going for you, but for me, they went very, very slowly. If you're a freshman, they probably seemed like the semester went by in a blink. But always at the end, we get to a situation where there's a lot of material and have to make some decisions. So I want you to listen very carefully today. And Friday is our last quiz, which is our second last lecture. This is the second last recorded lecture. So there's 3 lectures to listen to, a quiz. The assignment should be done by the time you watch this. And we have the final exam and then summer vacation. So as I said, some of the things I teach out of order from the book. So you had to kind of go back a bit and look at some things. And now we're moving forward in the book again from page 198, okay? So like I said, the quiz sort of begins at the end of chapter 4 and goes to the middle of chapter 6, page 198, where it mentions the California Gold Rush. Now, there's a lot of things that allow America to expand, but as I told you, don't be surprised if this question comes up about the 19th century being basically an isolationist country. The reason that it looks like they're expanding is because they have a lot of empty land, which is very uncommon unless you go back thousands of years and your tribe came across a place that had a natural disaster or had not been occupied by somebody for a long time, or there was some geological event like an earthquake or volcano separating peoples from that kind of thing, or an island that lost its population a long time ago. This kind of stuff did happen, but not 200 years ago. 200 years ago, the Americans were in this enormous continent, all of them, the South Americans, North Americans, Canadians, Mexicans. They were in the situation where the place was very underpopulated, even for the time. You add industrialization and like European and Asian levels of population, and basically North America looks empty, okay? You still can see the population of density in a place like America, which has a lot of good land to live on, is much lower than a place like China or India. And if they had had their civilization uninterrupted for 5,000 years, then you would probably see 1 billion people living in America too, because they can support that population just as well as China can. America has the most arable, fertile land of any country in the world, for the record. Canada has the most fresh water. Russia has the most territory. China's the 4th biggest country in the world. So these places should have higher populations. Russia is obviously too cold in a lot of cases, makes it difficult to live there, just like Canada. But the United States, ideal conditions in many places for life. However, there is, like I mentioned in some other lectures, the center of the United States is very flat. Mountains in the west and flat in the middle, and then the Mississippi Valley, and then more mountains. That's sort of the interior of the United States. A lot of that area, especially the central area and the western area towards California, western Texas, Nevada, it's very dry. Gets some of Las Vegas gets the least rainfall of any place in the United States. That's not a place where you want to make a city traditionally. Only the Industrial Revolution and technology will allow the United States to create this thing, this entertainment, gambling city full of shows and different kinds of services in the middle of the desert. You can't do that 200 years ago. It sort of becomes a product of American success, American wealth, and American technology. So keep those 5 things from the very first lecture in mind. The Americans' emphasis on freedom and opportunity and education and democracy, right? Exceptionalism, that sounds like a possible question longer question on the exam, if you ask me. So they're isolationists, but they don't have to behave like isolationists because they can expand and not contact any large populations. They keep contacting smaller groups of people organized normally into tribes or confederations, and those are the Native Americans. But there's so few of them relative to the number of Europeans that they just don't treat them fairly and dismiss them in many cases. There's a big gap between them in terms of their equipment and in terms of their sophisticated lifestyles and how many things they need. The native lifestyle requires a lot more, a lot less interdependence on other parts of society. You can basically live by yourself if you're a native person, almost, at least in a family unit. But in American society, everybody depends on everyone, especially these people who live in really dry areas. They grow a whole bunch of potatoes, or they grow a whole bunch of corn, or they grow a whole bunch of barley, tons of it, and then they send it east and they sell it as whiskey, or they sell it as bourbon, or they sell it as grain, or they sell it as cash crop or as food supply, sell it as flour. Depends on what part of the process they're at, and there's immense amounts of this stuff being produced. But they have to trade because they can't just survive on potatoes and barley. So they don't have very much wood, so they're trading. The money system starts to become very effective because you need American dollars to buy wooden doors for your house, you need windows, you need metal utensils to cook things. The people out, in New York City need to eat their bread. So the grain farmers are doing their job, and in the East, the industrial North is doing their thing too. After the South is reconstructed, they start to industrialize and they start to participate in some of these things too. The plantations disappear and they're replaced sort of by like factory organized plantations. They still do grow cash crops, obviously, but the amount of money that's involved in it, it's not king cotton anymore. The American economy starts to rely less and less on cotton and tobacco and sugar and those resources and manufacturing them, and starting to provide things like oil, building railroads, building ships, making machines that transport people. They're doing that kind of stuff too. They're not just taking agricultural products and then finishing those agricultural products and then selling them to other markets. Now they're starting to do the second phase of industrialization, using power sources like what they first call rock oil, oil. They start using oil to, they invent the combustion engine. All these things start to happen around the 19th century. One of the most important things is that what they call the frontier, the edge of America, goes all the way to the ocean, and then they say is closed. The edge of America, there is no edge anymore. The ocean is. Everything, all the continent within the borders is now either in native territory, American territory, or an American state. And they continue to, absorb the territories until everything is a state, and the reservations are on federal or state land within those places. The gold rush, I told you about the Mexican-American War, and I told you about Davy Crockett being a hero and about the Alamo. The ultimate result was a huge amount of territory was lost by Mexico. In the peace treaty they signed, they agreed to give up this territory as part of being as being the loser in this conflict for control of Western America, you might call it. The Americans defeat them completely. They don't really have any position or strength to negotiate. So the original argument, the original cause of the fight was Texas becoming independent, and then Texas asking for protection from the United States from Mexico because it wanted to be independent. And then it's as a result of the American protection, Americans saying, well, why don't you just become a state officially, and then we'll protect you from now on. And then they added all of those states west, like I said, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and California, all the way to the ocean, making sort of a line between the Mexican territory, northern Spain, northern Mexico, what was New Spain, northern New Spain, and the southern United States in the west, right? So it goes from Texas straight across. It's not a straight line. It follows some rivers here and there. But there's already a lot of Spanish people or mixed people living in America, and a lot of those people stay. There's over 50 million people of Hispanic descent in California, Texas, and New Mexico. That area is still almost half Mexican American. It's about 60% not Hispanic. So that's including other populations too. So sometimes, in some cases, they are actually the majority. Like in New Mexico, 50% of people are Hispanic American. So that's not normal in most of the states, but in that state, it's true. They consider themselves American. I think there hasn't been any. Texas sometimes says they want to be independent and be their own country again, but nobody really takes them seriously, and I don't think they have any serious plans. The Americans took over this. This is between the Civil War, which we discussed, which is on the quiz. This, what I'm talking about today, is not. The California Gold Rush, I told you, we're kind of jumping around forward and backward, but the important event is the Civil War. The American Revolutionary War causes the Civil War to a certain extent, and the Industrial Revolution causes the differences in development in the North and the South, and the economic situation makes slaves more profitable, and the exploitation of slaves and the contradiction of, the moral idea of human rights and of creating a republic for people that's fair, and then pretending that the system that you use to exploit human beings isn't going to continue indefinitely, forever, and that's never going to be dealt with, is always just kind of in the back of the room. We call it in English the elephant in the room. Whenever you're talking about politics and people's rights and stuff, and you're talking about natives and how you treat them, or how you treat Hispanic people, or how you treat Irish people even, or how you treat Europeans, that you might be an American guy who's from England, but how are you gonna treat the new people from England? All these things are pretty hard to talk about when it's not supposed to matter, but in the most serious case, it matters. There's 4 million African Americans in the slave system. And every time you talk about people's rights, you say, but what about all those people? That's the biggest human rights problem in the country. Might be at this time getting to be one of the biggest human rights problems in the world, right? This is a huge number of people. So Europeans are one by one getting rid of slavery already. They're not as dependent on it as America is, and they're not the colonists are living amongst them, but of course in France there's not very many slaves anyway. Slavery is already gone, and in England slavery hasn't been allowed for hundreds of years. So when they say in 1811 there's no more slavery in England, that doesn't really mean that the English changed their lifestyle at all. It's just Jamaica or the Bahamas or territories overseas, they should be following the rules in the British Empire, the same rules that England has had for like 600 years, going like back to closer to the Magna Carta. So it is a sort of a backward system, and it's a contradictory system. Mexico loses all this land, and then right after they sign over California, they find gold. And it's one of the biggest gold strikes in the world. So this guy finds piles of gold when he's building a building, and he finds it. It's just basically sitting in riverbeds and sitting on the ground. It's not that difficult to get. It's just sitting on the ground where he's trying to build. So he just digs up a little bit and he finds huge amounts of money and becomes rich forever. Thousands of people copy this and they move. The strike is in 48. I always remember the year easily, because there's a football team from San Francisco called the 49ers. The reason they're called the 49ers is because the 49ers that's the year, that's the generation of gold miners. So they named their football team after the gold hunters that rushed to California. Most of them men. Some of them even came from as far away as China, though. With those rumors of gold, it was terrible, though. Obviously, there's mountains, and some people don't know how to survive in the woods. They didn't bring enough food. There's grizzly bears and wolves, and it's freezing cold in the mountains at night. Other people might want to steal your gold if you find some. Like, there's lots of parodies of that. Some people found gold and immediately they got murdered by somebody, and their gold got stolen before they ever came back from the mountains. So there's people disappearing, and there's too many men. The population takes decades to level out. They ignore all the natives in the neighborhood, and if they cause any problems, they kill them or they force them to move. So that's the policy that America adopts towards expansion. Doesn't sound very isolationist. It doesn't sound like they're protecting. It sounds like they're pushing all the time, which is not really a truly isolationist country. They just say that because they're not involved in international politics, right? Okay, so the next part really you'll have to read about this somewhat yourself. We've talked about this when we talked about Columbus already, so you should not forget everything that I said. The main thing that killed the native people was disease, probably over 90%. Less than 10%, probably more like less than 5% of the native people were killed in actual combat. Being displaced, being cold, not being able to hunt and find food, or having your family units damaged and not being able to survive, all those side effects are also valid. But just direct, what we think of as like having battles and shooting people, that stuff didn't happen until mostly the middle, around the Civil War time. That's why the Civil War is so important. The Civil War kind of stops this fighting with the natives for a while, but it never really stops. In the beginning, the natives don't know what to do with them, and then they have these big battles right at the beginning, which they almost kill the British and almost killed the Dutch and the French when they fought. But the British survived, and then that was the last chance, like in the 1600s, was the last chance that there was enough native people that they might have been able to kill them or threaten them or force them to evacuate America. After that, the population of the British and the French and other Europeans was too large. However, as they started pressing across, and they made it to California, and there's lots of wagons going on the Oregon Trail, over the Mississippi, across the plains, these native people get pushed into corners. The most famous one is the Lakota, probably the Sioux Confederation. They were very fierce warriors. They rode horses, and they shot guns and they shot arrows. They got their horses. They found their horses when the Spanish horses were brought in the 1500s, and they tamed them and learned how to ride them, and so they became much more effective fighters, and they used European guns when they could. So there was a famous battle where the natives won a battle against Custard, Colonel Custard, not Colonel Mustard or the Colonel from KFC, but Colonel Custard was sort of a symbolic, representative young officer in the American military. He had long blonde hair and a neat uniform and stuff, and he wanted to prove that he was a good officer, and he took a big risk, and he fought in Dakota. That's why it's called South Dakota and North Dakota, because of the tribe, the Lakota. In the Black Hills there, they found gold, and the Sioux didn't want to give up the territory, naturally, because it belonged to them. But the military said, you have to move because we want that gold. They had a battle. Custer got ambushed, and his unit was completely wiped out. The several thousand Lakota Sioux warriors couldn't stay together though, because they don't have the supply chain, so they don't have the resources to stay together. So they disbanded into their tribes, and the American military sent more and more groups and commands, units and soldiers, and there was never a significant setback for the Americans against the natives again. That's the end of the Indian American Wars. They go on for about 100 years. And in 1890, the frontier is closed. No more expansion. We're at the edge of the ocean. The north is Canada, the south is Mexico. Frontier is closed. That's when they start to think about expansion, and they get in a fight with Spain over Cuba, and then they fight against Spain in the Philippines, and then suddenly America is sort of taking care of these territories that are not part of America. That's not isolationism anymore, that's imperialism. And that's the thing they were trying to stay away from, and that's what they fought against. However, they considered making Cuba and Philippines part of their country, but again, the concern was they're not American, they're not white people, they're not going to vote the right way. So if we would be creating Cuba, we'd be creating a state of African Americans, of Cubans, we'd be creating maybe several states of Philippines, and they wouldn't vote the same way as the other American states. So we're not going to give them statehood. That's pretty much how the end of the century ends, and we have a lot of things to talk about. We have to talk about World War I and World War II, and we have to talk about all the 20th century, which is chapter 7. So finish reading chapter 6 and all the little native, all the different native tribes. There's a list of about 5 famous ones. I'll go over them briefly in class on Friday. Make sure you read about them and focus on sort of their main characteristic or their main attribute so you can recognize them from other types of natives, because we need to know there were hundreds of different types. So you need to read that over and make sure you know that stuff, and I'll pick out some important things to mention before I talk about the 20th century, World War I, World War II, and how America, ends up being a superpower by the middle of the 21st. And then that's probably, we won't be able to go too much farther to that. We'll end up stopping somewhere around the 1980s, probably before I was born, just when I was born, and a few decades before you were born. At least you're more familiar with American culture now, so that's probably the best section to leave out, because now you have all the information up to your own generation almost. So then you can make better decisions and judgments and understand why people are interacting and saying things the way they are. Don't forget the cowboys. Cowboys are largely a myth created by Hollywood, but there were cowboys that brought many cows to market. Normally they were in the Central American desert plains, grasslands, and they had to bring them up to Chicago, usually, was where they were put on trains and put on ships and then slaughtered to make beef. So cowboys, their job was really tough, and they usually weren't like gangster type or bad cops or sheriffs that like cleaned up towns and stuff. Most cowboys slept on the ground. We're not handsome and famous actors like Clint Eastwood. Some of them were African American. There was all kinds of different people doing that job. It was really tough. They used to sleep out on the grass to protect the cows, and they had to move them, thousands of kilometers, and then sell them at the market in order to get paid for their job. So usually people would see them not when they were working and sleeping out in the desert on the sand and the grass and under trees and singing lonely songs like cowboy songs do, like cowboy songs sound like, but they would probably see them in Chicago when they were done 6 months of work and they finally got paid, and then they were getting drunk and then pulling out their guns and getting in fist fights and stuff like that. That is partially true. Journalist over exaggerated that though, because the newspaper guy didn't go into the desert and do, National Geographic studies on the Cowboys. When they did their, stories for the newspaper, they were in Chicago, outside the saloons, outside the bars, outside the restaurants, on the street, watching the behavior of the Cowboys. And you might say it's the same thing with a sailor. People always say sailors are terrible, have no morals, and they drink a lot, and they fight all the time, and they cause trouble. Well, I think they do. Sometimes they're on a ship for 6 months. Sometimes they're on a ship for a year. And they finally get off the ship and they kind of lose control of themselves. The Cowboys had a similar kind of cycle where, they get everything out of their system and they have to go back to work for another 6 months, another season, and work hard and do that until the next big party in Chicago. So that'll finish off chapter 6, and we'll do our best. We're going to do chapter 7 on Friday, and in the final recorded lecture, one more quiz, one more exam, and that's it for this semester. Thank you for understanding. We had holidays and people were sick and we had events, rescheduled things and everything, but somehow we're near the end now. So just hang in there, work hard, and a couple weeks later, you can take a break and enjoy your vacation. Thanks again for listening. Have a good day, and see you on Friday.